Hi, and welcome to this presentation of the findings of the economic impact of music in Europe, a study by Oxford Economics, the global economic forecasting consultancy, commissioned by IFPI, the body that represents the recording industry worldwide. I'm Lindsay Goldthorpe. I work in the communications team at IFPI and will be moderating today's session. It's great to be with you at Milan Music Week. I'm joined by our panelists, Pete Collings, Director of Economic Impact Consulting, Europe and Middle East at Oxford Economics, and Xenia Manning, Director of International Trade at IFPI. Xenia, coming to you first. The study measures the impact of the music sector on GDP, jobs, tax and exports across 27 members of the European Union and the UK. Talk us through the reasons behind IFPI commissioning this study and why did Oxford Economics make such a good partner?
Thank you, Lindsay, and hello to everyone at Milan Music Week. It's really a pity not to be able to be there in person, but I hope maybe next year in better circumstances. So why did IFPI commission this study? I think we all know that music has a lot of importance in our lives. It's vital to our well-being, to our cultural identity, and it also carries a lot of economic value. But when it comes to that issue of economic value, there is actually a very clear lack of data. So we wanted to have an objective and comprehensive economic study that would plug that information gap and provide ourselves, our partners in the sector, and also governments with concrete and authoritative data on all the key metrics of the economic contribution of the sector to the economy. And we were quite ambitious in terms of scope, so we wanted to study that would cover all of the EU, including the UK at the time. And we looked for consultancies that would have the right type of background in the sense of being very reputable for their economic expertise, independence, and accuracy of their work. And Oxford Economics is a leader in forecasting, which is one of the areas of economics where you can objectively verify if the forecast was correct or not. So we were very pleased to partner up and to undertake this project. We do hope that it will lead to further work in other regions, and Oxford Economics has also other offices around the world. So we hope that in the future we'll be able to take the learnings of the study in Europe to other regions.
Thanks, Xenia. And as we've touched on, the study covers the entire music sector across the EU27 and the UK. How were you able to go about gathering such comprehensive data?
We had to reach out to absolutely everybody in the music sector. Every corner of it was contacted. And I really would want to say a huge thank you for the great cooperation that we received from so many organizations, companies, and individual sector participants, because that was fundamental. We had to get first-hand source data because for the music sector, unfortunately, government statistics do not provide a full comprehensive picture. And there is a long list of credits and acknowledgements in the study. I would not dare to try to mention every entity that helped us, but I really would want to say a big thank you for everybody's help.
Great. And we'll come on to talk to Pete in a bit more depth on the findings shortly. But how useful is a study of this kind for the music sector, and how do you plan on using it going forward?
Findings of this type are absolutely essential because this is the only way to objectively demonstrate the importance of music sector's contribution to the economy. It's important to have data in order to illustrate that importance to the governments and enable governments to make evidence-based policy making. It's not sufficient to have appeals to emotions. It is absolutely fundamental that we should be able to illustrate how much of the GDP of the EU28 and the UK is dependent on this sector, how many people are employed by it, and the other metrics that will be covered in Pete's presentation.
Yeah, and Pete, coming to you now, the study brings together so many different parts of the music sector, as we've already mentioned, across numerous countries. How do you approach a study like this? And perhaps you can take us through some of the key findings as well.
Sure, thank you, Lindsay, and hello to everyone. Yeah, very sorry we can't be there in person. It is a real shame. So if I share my screen now. Okay, so I'd like to walk you through the headline findings for the study, but I think first of all, it's important to start with a sense of how do we explore economic impact? What do we mean when we talk about economic impact, and how do we measure economic impact? So we start with what we call the direct impact. So to put this simply, this is the activities that a sector, in this case the music sector, undertakes. And when we think about how do we measure that, we really run on three simple metrics, or three metrics. So the first one is the number of people that are employed within the sector. And then obviously in music, there's a very sort of complicated approach we need to take to that, because individuals may have different roles within the sector. Some may be songwriters, some may be performers, some may be both. And as I'll come on to, there's lots of different data sources coming into a study such as this, and we need to make sure that when we do include those, we're not counting people more than once. So we need to make sure that we get an accurate picture of how many people are actually active within the sector within Europe. Moving on from people, we also want to see how it contributes to the economy as a whole. And the way we do that is we look at not its revenues, but actually the profits it makes or losses, and the wages that it pays to its employees. Now we focus on profits and wages because together they're what economists call gross value added. Now, economists are interested in gross value added because when you take the gross value added to the profits and the wages of every company and every organization in an economy and sum them up and make a few adjustments for subsidies and taxes, you end up with that economy's GDP. So by looking at gross value added as opposed to revenues, we're actually measuring the size of the music sector against the terms that governments measure the economy. We're measuring it in terms of GDP. And then the final measure that we use to explore the economic footprint of the music industry is the taxes that it pays, and then also it supports the rest of the economy. And when I say taxes, what we're thinking here about is corporate income tax, personal income tax paid by the employees present within the sector, and then also the social security contributions that employers and employees make as part of the sector's operations. So that's the direct impact, is the activities of the sector itself. But its footprint extends far beyond that. In order to undertake its operations, it procures services, it purchases goods and services from a whole range of different suppliers that sit outside of the sector. And these can range from food supplies to business services and banking. And all of these purchases make a vital contribution to the economy. And we capture that in what we call the indirect supply chain impact. So within this channel of impact, we take those purchases and determine what is the level of value added that's being supported in the company supplying these goods or services to the music sector. How many jobs are supported by that purchase, and how much in taxes is raised because of that purchase. But then we do one other thing. We also think, well, what do the companies that are supplying the music sector need themselves to purchase in order to provide those goods or services? And then again, what do their suppliers need to provide, and so on and so forth. So in the end, we have models that enable us to map out how that initial purchase by the music sector ripples across the European economy, industry by industry and country by country, to a point where we have a whole picture of what is the activity that's supported by the supply chain and where is it located, both geographically and within the economy in terms of which industries. And again, we can measure that in terms of the employment that's supported, the contribution to GDP that is created, and the tax revenues that are raised on the back of that activity. The third channel of impact is very similar to the supply chain impact, but it doesn't focus on the spending of the firms within the music sector. It focuses on the spending of the employees, and also the employees who are located in the music sector supply chain. As these people are employed, they're being paid wages, and in return for these wages, they're going out and spending them on everyday household consumption, Obviously, it's very different in 2020 than it was in 2018 in terms of, going out to leisure activities, spending money on, music events, cinemas, restaurants, all the things we liked to do and would like to do quite soon, hopefully. But all of these purchases are supporting activity within these establishments. And again, it's supporting jobs, it's supporting contribution to GDP, and it's supporting tax revenues. And it's stimulating further supply chain activity in the supply chains of those establishments as well. So again, we map out how that consumer spending ripples out across the economy too. And that's our third channel, the induced consumer spending effect. Then taking the direct impact, the indirect impact, and the induced impact, we bring those all together and we are able to articulate the total economic impact of the music sector on the European economy. Again, measuring on those three metrics, so employment, contribution to GDP, and tax revenues. So that's sort of the underlying framework that we employ in order to assess both the music sector's contribution to Europe's economy and also any other sector's contribution to an economy. So it's a very standard approach. However, what's not necessarily standard for the music sector is how do we define the sector? Now, this is a challenge we have for any study. And in some studies, it's relatively straightforward. In other studies, it's more complicated. And what we found is the music sector is a very large and complex web of different organizations and individuals who are operating within the sector. So in order to get a clear definition, what we've done is we borrowed the WIPO approach for exploring and quantifying the sector. And in doing so, what we've really driven for is splitting the sector into what we call core activities and then sort of interdependent activities. So within the core sector, you can think of that as being the production of music and almost like the delivery of music, if you will. So production, you're thinking along the lines of songwriters, performers, recording studios, record companies, and publishers. And then by delivery, I mean sort of the means by which consumers consume music. So radio, television, streaming platforms, physical music, and the like. Then in terms of sort of the interdependent, so that's sort of the broader sphere of the music sector, here they're all really sort of inputs to help the core activity. So it could be along the lines of the music instruments or consumer equipment. So thinking along music systems, smartphones, and the like. So there's really sort of two different elements to the sector that we're exploring and quantifying together. Now, it's important to note, and Xenia just touched on how sort of the data operation underpinned this this study. And the reason why that was required was a lot of the information that we require for any impact assessment is available from public sources. However, with the music sector, with the diverse nature of the operations and the activities and the organizations that are undertaking it, there's no one sector and there's no multiple sectors that will fit into government statistics. So really you've got to drill into the statistics to go as far as you can to get the relevant data. And unfortunately, that in some cases, that data just doesn't exist. So what we've had to do is we've actually had to go to individual companies, go to trade bodies and gather information on their own operations, on how they interact with other elements of the music sector, how they interact with other elements of the economy, in order to build the picture for the economic impact assessment. So again, echoing Xenia's thanks to all of those who assisted us with this process. So before going through the results of the study, I think it's worth highlighting how the music sector interacts with itself. So that's an odd phrase to use, but from an economist's perspective, what we're interested in is how companies are purchased from other companies. And so these interactions are important, especially when we think about the general framework that we explore in terms of measuring economic impact. We want to know how the sector is interacting with the rest of the economy. And in doing so, we also need to know how it's interacting with other entities within its own sector. And what we found is it's a highly integrated sector. So taking record companies as an example, we find that around 60% of their procurement, so their purchases of goods or services from external suppliers, is actually sourced from other firms within the music sector. and there's only around 39% of their procurement is actually going into the rest of the economy, so outside of the music sector. So it's an important finding just to know how interlinked the entire music sector is. So it's sort of almost the first key takeaway from the study. Moving on to the actual results themselves, thinking about the contribution to GDP first, what we found is that in 2018, the sector directly contributed 37.5 billion euros to the GDP of the EU27 and the UK. To put that into context, that's 1.5 times larger than the contribution made by the wine and beer manufacturing sectors within Europe. Then when we include the supply chains and consumer spending impacts as well, we find that the footprint of the music sector grows to just under 82 billion euro, again in 2018. And again, putting that into context, that's actually larger than the economies of 9 EU countries in 2018. So it's a very substantial footprint. And the final takeaway on the GDP side is that we see that the 82 billion total footprint relative to the direct footprint means that the music sector has a GDP multiplier of 2.2. Now, what does that mean? That means that for every euro of value that's created within the music sector, an additional 1.2 are created in the rest of the economy. So it means it's really sort of driving value for the economy as a whole. And that multiplier varies across the different subsections of the music sector. So for example, we've already seen that the record companies are very reliant on the rest of the music sector in order to undertake their activities. We find that their GDP multiplier is actually 2.8. So what that means is for every euro of value they are adding to the economy, there's an additional 1.8 being generated in the rest of the economy. And that includes their their suppliers within the rest of the music sector, because they're outside of the record companies themselves. Moving on to the employment measure, we estimate that around 1.3 million people are employed in the sector in 2018. And that's about a quarter higher than the audiovisual sector as a whole in Europe. Looking at when we include the supply chain and consumer spending impacts as well, we see that employment actually rises to 2 million, or just a shade over 2 million people in 2018. And to put that again into context, that represents 1 in every 119 jobs across Europe. So that's irrespective of what industry those jobs are located in and what country they're located in. So it's getting on for nearly 1% of all employment in Europe can be attributable in some way to the music sector. Moving on to the final metric, so tax receipts, we find that the sector directly paid, so in the form of corporate income taxes, personal income taxes, and social security contributions, around 14.3 billion in tax receipts in 2018. And when we expand that out to the full footprint, that figure increases to 31 billion. And again, to put that into context, because these are, I've realized I'm throwing a lot of numbers around here. So 31 billion actually represents nearly 20% of the entire EU budget that year. So again, it's a very sizable contribution. Finally, one area we also explored was how the sector drives exports for Europe. Now, I mentioned that data can be difficult, or has been difficult, gathering information from the various elements in the sector. This is particularly true on exports. So exporting goods, data on exporting goods is very readily available. It's easy to track a physical product and record when it leaves and arrives in a country. With digital goods, such as streaming and downloads and other services, it's very, very hard. And to be honest, statistics agencies are getting better, but they're not quite there yet in terms of how they measure these. So what we've actually had to do is we had to go to record companies, music streaming platforms, and music publishers to get an idea of the level of exports that they're undertaking. So what we've produced is actually a sort of very conservative estimate of the level of exports that the sector is generating for the EU. But what we find is that music-related goods, so this is things like music systems or sort of music or smartphones, taking into account the share of of their value that could be attributable to the music sector, accounted for around 3.3 billion euros of exports in 2018. Whereas record companies, it was between 2.3 and 2.4, and then streaming is around 1.2 billion. But in total, and again, this is a conservative estimate, we believe that the music sector exported around 9.7 billion worth of exports in 2018. And again, to put that into context, in Europe, we have a lot of products which are protected due to their origin or where they're produced. So these geographical indication goods, one of which is wines. And we actually found that the music sector's exports exceeded those of those protected wines by 13% that year. So again, it's a very substantial figure. So bringing all of those numbers together, just to build up sort of a picture of how the music sector contributes to the economy, we can really only sort of underscore that it's a key contributor to the European economy, supporting almost 82 billion euros of activity in 2018, 2 million jobs, 31 billion euro of tax revenues, and then again, as I just mentioned, a conservative estimate of 9.4 billion euros in exports. These are obviously some very sort of headline findings from the studies, and we do encourage people to go and read the study in its entirety to see what other snippets they can find, that demonstrate the contribution that the study the music sector makes to the economy.
Thank you, Pete, for taking us through the findings. I was just wondering, as an economist, you obviously have done many of these types of economic impact studies. So in your professional opinion, were there any surprises or any information that you found was particularly interesting in the findings of this study?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one we get asked a lot in terms of what is surprising for when we conduct these studies. And I think the key thing that jumped out at me was just the size of the contribution and the relative scale of the contribution, because I think people know music, but maybe they don't get a full appreciation for how big the sector is. And obviously, I've highlighted the interactions that occur within the sector, but obviously it's interacting far more broadly with the economy as a whole. And some of the figures that we mentioned, the fact that it's bigger than 9 EU states in terms of their economies, that's a large chunk of the European economy that we're talking about. And similarly, the tax revenues raised, representing a fifth of the EU budget that year. These are substantial figures that were surprising.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting to hear an economist's perspective on the findings.
Yes, great. Thanks, Pete. Really appreciate you running us through those findings of the economic impact of music in Europe. I think that concludes our session for today, and I'd just like to say thanks for Pete and Xenia for taking time to talk to us, and thanks to Milan Music Week for having us as well. And if you'd like to read the report in full, you can visit the Oxford Economics website at the URL below. Thanks again.